This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we got a special guest on the podcast today. His name is Jeremy Stalnecker. So he is an author and speaker, and he is a retired Marine, because you are technically never a former Marine, but he was in the United States Marine Corps. He was an infantry officer and an Iraq war veteran. He also received the Navy Commendation Medal with V for Combat Valor. And also, he is the co-founder and CEO of the Mighty Oaks Foundation. So we've had Chad Robichaux on the podcast several times, and he is the co-founder of that organization. I really, really enjoyed our conversation today because I was on his show like 2 or 3 years ago or something like that. And we just haven't really found the time to get him here on this podcast. But on this podcast, we talked about jiu-jitsu. We talked about him and his son. And that's what got him into jiu-jitsu because, his 13-year-old son took his back and basically was about to choke him unconscious. He's like, oh crap, I guess I need to get with it and get with the program. So we talked about that at the beginning, but then we talked about why the Marine Corps, why did he want to get in, what it was like being in combat, some of the differences between a combat veteran and somebody that never saw combat and kind of what that looks like. I also asked him, hey, if you were a 17-year-old today, as opposed to, back in the day, would you join the military with all the issues we see with the wokeness in the military and not focusing on the things that the military should be focusing on, more worried about DEI and not really worried about lethality. And so we get into a lot of that as well. But then we talk about him getting into ministry after leaving the Marine Corps, how that led to the Mighty Oaks Foundation, what they can do to help out veterans. And so for any of you guys out there that are veterans, about to become a veteran, because you're going to be leaving the military soon, or that you've got veterans that that are kind of in your world that are loved ones, I would really appreciate you sticking around to kind of talk, hear him talk more about his program to see if it would help those folks or to help you. Also, he has this moniker called March or Die. And so towards the end of the episode, we actually get into the moniker. Hey, where does that come from? How do we really use that? And then we flow at the end a little bit more about men's ministry versus man-friendly churches. And there were some other subjects that I can't really remember right now, but it was a very, very fun conversation. I think you guys will enjoy it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jeremy Stalnecker, welcome to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast.
Thanks, Kyle. Good to be with you, man.
It's good to be with you, and I got to say, it's taken us a while to pay this off because I was on your show roughly 17 years ago, and so now we're finally taking care of this. But right from the beginning, I think I have some issues with you personally. It's because I don't think I can trust your judgment of human beings because you were like really, really good friends with Chad Robichaux, right. And he is one of the more problematic and least impressive human beings that I know personally. So what in the world is wrong with you?
Yeah, he's a real quiet guy. He's very hard to get to know. He doesn't talk to you much.
I know, it's so frustrating.
Man, so Chad and I go back a long way, right? And we've been through an awful lot together. And it's been one of my best friends.
Very good. And so now, is Chad the one that got you into jiu-jitsu?
So yes and no. That's a yes and no question. So my son was 12 years old. And he was overweight and really enjoyed playing video games. And so, at the time I was pastoring a church and I knew that we needed to get him into something physical. And I'm like, man, I'm not going to do the sports thing, teams, running around all weekend. Part of it is we can't. And part of it is I just don't want to. So I sat my kids down, both of them. And I said, look, let's be honest. I don't know if you should have this conversation with your 12-year-old, but let's be honest. You're not going to be a professional athlete. Like, let's just be honest, right? You're not going to be a professional basketball player or baseball player, but you need to do something. So what would you be interested in? We need to get you out doing stuff. And we had a good martial arts gym near our house. And I didn't know a lot about jiu-jitsu at the time. I knew it was a thing, right? And I had met Chad and I knew, kind of what he was into, but we weren't close. But there was a gym and my son said, well, I wouldn't mind trying that out. And it was a big gym. They had, Muay Thai, they had jiu-jitsu, of course, they had boxing. And so I knew if we paid the membership, he'd find something he wouldn't mind doing. And we got him into that gym. Crazy story. So I reached out to Chad and I'm like, hey, I'm getting my son into this gym. A lot of instructors. Do you know any of these people? And the Muay Thai instructor, the kickboxing instructor, Daniel Kim, not only was kind of, world ranked and incredible kickboxing instructor, but he had trained Chad for several of his fights. He started out of his gym in Houston. So that was a connection. So my son started training at 12 and Chad goes, now you got to be careful because he's going to start learning stuff and he may be smaller than you, but jiu-jitsu is really powerful. I'm like, it's all right. We're rolling around in my living room one evening and my probably 13 at this time year old son took my back and man, I was going out. I reached down, I grabbed his foot. He's barefoot. And I'm going to break your toes. I don't care. You're going to let go of me. Right.
Oh, come
And he let go, and I paid his medical insurance. So I'm like, it'll be fine. He let go, and I'm like, I need to start training. So Chad definitely encouraged me. And then we all moved together. Chad and his family and my family moved to Southern California at the same time. And he found a gym, and we got into it. And that's when I started training. So yeah, man, jiu-jitsu for me is, it's a personal thing like it is for anyone who trains, but it's a family thing. All 4 of my kids have trained. My son, that son is a police officer now. When he was 12, we got him in just to get him to do something. He would end up he was homeschooled at the time. He'd spend 4 hours a day there. He'd go through all the classes, and it really shaped his life, and has shaped kind of our family dynamic. So a long answer to your question, but yeah, Chad definitely was instrumental, but there were a lot of factors that got us into it, and I'm still training. So yeah, it's awesome.
Well, I'm going to ask you follow-up questions, so it's going to be even longer because this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. So the last picture I saw of you was you and your son. I think you were both purple belts. Or what level are you at now? I'm
a brown belt. He's also a brown belt. If he trained more, he would be a black belt, but he's working a lot. But yeah, brown. Yeah, I've been training for about 10 years.
Okay, so obviously, like I'm a walking billboard for jiu-jitsu because, we constantly talk about spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. And, I loved baseball. I played baseball my whole life. It's the sport that I've played probably more than any other sport other than jiu-jitsu, but it's just not hard in the same way. It's probably the hardest thing to do is hitting a spherical ball with a round bat squarely. Like that doesn't even make sense to say. It's probably one of the more difficult things you can do, but it's not like hard to do. You don't really have to be resilient to be a baseball player. You just need a lot of skill and a lot of practice. But in terms of resilience for a kid, I mean, the confidence I've seen little kids that were, smaller bodied kids that were getting picked on. And then all of a sudden they start training jiu-jitsu and they're walking, head up with their shoulders back and chest out, and not because they're ready for a fight, but not because they're picking a fight, but they are ready for a fight now. And so the value that a kid can get from the discipline and from all that, we get it. But the hardest problem I have, Jeremy, is with adults. And so these are adults. These are guys that are in their 30s and 40s. And by now I've been training for, this is 7 years, as of right now is how long I've been training. I've heard every excuse in the world for why guys can't do it. I don't have time. Well, what about the business? Well, what if I get hurt? I just love golf too much. Dude, I'm never going to get into a fight. Like, dude, I conceal carry. I don't need to know how to fight with my body and my hands. Like, just, hey, if something happens, I'll call the police. Like, I keep hearing all of these things. And it's like, there's the self-defense mechanism of it, because obviously you can stop a fight in its tracks, or you can end a threat before it becomes a threat towards you. But then there's all the ancillary benefits of it. But for you, talking to guys that are in your world, like, how do you kind of get guys involved in it? Because again, the biggest one is injuries, and most guys won't actually say that because they know it makes them sound like a puss, and so they're not going to be like, well, I'm scared I'm going to get hurt. Well, the odds of you getting hurt, chipping balls onto the green at your local golf course are not very high, but there's also no transferable value to being able to chip a ball onto the green. It's only valuable in a golf context, whereas jiu-jitsu is valuable inside the room and outside the room. So keep flowing on that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's funny. I was having similar conversation last night. There's a white belt in our gym, and he's been training for a while. He's still a white belt. And we were sitting against the wall talking, and he's like, man, I come in here and some days I feel like I'm doing great and some days I'm not. And we went through that, like, what's that saying? Some days you're the hammer and some days you're the nail. And I said that to him. He started laughing, and he's like, I just want to learn to defend myself. And I said, for me, this is just Jeremy talking, and I was talking to him. For me, defending myself out on the street is like at the bottom of my list of reasons that I train jiu-jitsu. And everyone thinks it's about fighting and it's about this and that. I'm thankful that I feel confident. And if something happened when I was out, honestly, if there's a door, I'm going to go through it, right? Like, I'm going to avoid fighting. I have no interest in it. But if I'm with my family or we're in a place or things happen, I know I can handle myself. And that's very important to me. But the reasons I train jiu-jitsu, that's near the bottom of the list. Part of it was first because my kids were there and I wanted to spend time with them. And so there are people who are adults, men who are adults, like, go do stuff with your kids. You're always talking about you don't have a connection, you don't this or that. Get your kids into jiu-jitsu. They learn something real they can use for the rest of their lives. They can train for the rest of their lives, and you get to be there with them. That, like, honestly, my kids are getting older. they're training kind of at their own times. It's been harder for me to get in the gym now because I'm not going with them. That to me is like the most special part about jiu-jitsu is training with people that you care about, with people that you love. So that's one thing. And then the community is incredible. If you're in a gym where the community is not incredible, go to another one. I can recommend some, right? There's some wonderful communities in the jiu-jitsu gym. It's so special, and like it's hard to explain, but you don't know these people most of the time outside of the gym, maybe a few of them, but the connection you have, the respect you have for each other is amazing. And then just the doing hard things.
Yeah.
I do not enjoy most of the time, rolling, particularly with people who are younger and faster and stronger than me. And you put on a purple or a brown belt. Now you have half the class trying to murder you to prove something, right? I'm like, I'm 47. I don't care. I'll tap. Like, you want to prove something? I'm not the guy, right? But it's doing hard things, man. And it's like, okay, I got to go to class. And I know what that means. It's going to be physically exhausting. It's going to be difficult. But here's what it does. It strikes at your pride. This is why I think even people who say like, well, it's injury or this or that, most jiu-jitsu gyms are very safe. Again, if you're in one that people are getting hurt all the time, you need to find another gym.
Right, exactly.
It strikes at your pride. That's why you don't like it, because you feel like I'm a tough guy or I'm a strong guy or I'm fit or I'm this or that. Look, I run ultra marathons. I feel like I'm very fit. My cardiovascular is very strong. I go to the gym and work out. If you get away from a jiu-jitsu gym for 3 weeks, your first roll is going to trash you. It's not the same. And so, again, in my world where I'm dealing with a lot of tough guys, a lot of veterans, people who have done really hard things in really austere environments, they've been in combat, I think the reason most of them don't want to train is because it's going to strike at their pride. They're going to have a 13-year-old kid, shred them on the mat. But to me, that's exactly the reason you need to be in there. So,
Jeremy, I literally wrote down ego when you were giving your first answer, because it's the hardest for the guys who are physically big, who are physically strong, who are athletically gifted. And I can't remember the guy that said it. It was just on some random, reel on Instagram or something. But he's like, the problem for most guys with jiu-jitsu is you can't just athlete your way out of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we all grew up with that kid that first time he picked up a football, he threw a 40-yard spiral. First time he picked up a basketball, three-pointer swish. He talked about this kid he knew growing up where he had never skateboarded. And he picks up a skateboard and he starts riding around a little bit. 30 minutes later, he's kickflipping, right? And that's a trick that guys may, practice for 6 months or a year or longer. Certain guys can do that. That doesn't happen in jiu-jitsu. You're not going to athlete your way into taking someone down and then doing a mounted triangle. It's just not going to happen. Now, you might be an explosive athlete. You might have some physical advantages where you can explode out of an armbar, or you can, keep a guy from taking you down because your hips just bounce off the mat because you're basically made of rubber. Like, I get that. But it's coming for everybody. Like, we've had some guys that were former NFL athletes, one linebacker and one safety, come into our gym. And you could see when they first started training, they were like, wait a minute, I am physically superior to every human being in here. What is going on? And to both of these guys' credit, they kept training. They're like, oh boy, I have found something in my post-NFL career that is like something different. Like, this is the first time I've never been dominant in an athletic context before, and I need to go through that. But most guys don't have that, Jeremy. Like, most guys don't get past white belt because they can't get past that grind. They can't sit there in the parking lot and like just make themselves go in. It goes back to the hammer and nail thing. Here's the thing, guys. All of us are nails forever. Unless your name's Gordon Ryan, the entire planet is a hammer, right? And even now, like, I have some physical advantages over some of the guys I train with and things like that. And, I've been training for a long time, so I don't get in bad positions as often as I used to. But there are classes, Jeremy, where I just get smashed. And there are those kids you talked about, homeschool kids and training. There's this kid named Jet. Yeah, exactly. There's this kid named Jet. Homeschooled. He started training jiu-jitsu when he was like 4 or 5 years old. And so he just got his brown belt here recently, but for all intents and purposes, he's 17 years old. He's a black belt. He's done well over 300 tournament and pro matches at this point. He beats black belts all the time. Jeremy, I've never scored on him. Like, I have a wrestling heavy style, right? I can get 2. You might tap me a bunch, but I can get 2. I've never scored on the kid. And here's the thing is, if you've got an ego problem, like, you're never going to be able to train. There was a guy that at white belt, now he's kind of a savant blue belt, so I feel better about it. But at white belt, I had his back as a purple belt, and I left my feet in the wrong position for a second. He kind of did an ankle lock on me. But if I had this ego problem, I would have gotten hurt because I wouldn't have tapped. But instead, you know what I did? I tap and I go, crap, man, you got me. I fell asleep for 2 seconds and you took advantage. Good for you. And I just feel like, Jeremy, most guys don't have that in any other context. They don't have that at work. They don't have that in their relationships. And I just like anything that we can do to get more guys into it, I'm there for, you know?
It's wild too. Like, people don't get this. If you go to like through a karate program, right? Like, there's testing requirements. There's, if you do these 4 things, then this is going to happen. Jiu-jitsu literally is you show up on day 1 and you can be learning something as basic as the guard position or something as advanced as, a rubber guard or some crazy, like you have to go inverted and do this thing. And it's day 1, right? Yeah. And in most schools, I know some schools have a curriculum and they have testing requirements, but most are not that way. It's, you're going to learn whatever's happening today. If you have a good instructor, he can tie the techniques throughout the week or the last couple of weeks together. You start to learn things, but you have to be committed. And that's what's crazy. You don't like, oh, I've got it now. No, you need to keep learning. And then you get to the next level and there's more to learn. There are more people, in front of you. You hear black belts talk about this all the time. I got promoted to black belt and I feel like I'm a white belt again because I'm starting over with all these guys who've been training for 40 years. And it's pretty insane. And if you're not willing to set your ego aside, you're not going to make it. There was a guy in our gym last night and he's been training for a couple of weeks. I've done some drilling with him and some rolling with him. And during our sparring, I looked up from the guy I was sparring with and he was kind of next to me. And he was going to get his arm broken. This kid was a wrestler that he was going against. He had him in a tight arm bar. And this guy has been training for 2 weeks. I'm sure he's a strong guy. He's a young guy. He's trying to hold it. I'm like, dude, stop. Like, tap. And he's like, no, he doesn't have it. No, he has it and he's going to break your arm. And if you're not willing to set your ego aside and like reset, then you're going to get killed. There's so many. I'm not a jiu-jitsu evangelist per se, but it's probably been the most powerful thing in my life to keep me grounded and keep me coming back to learning again. And then I'll just tell you just practically, my son, we got him in early. All of my kids have trained, but he has trained the most. And he started saying when he was like 13, 14, he wanted to be a police officer. So now it became a non-negotiable. And he's trained, he's training 5-6 days a week, right? So he loves it. He's in it. Now he's out on the street as a police officer doing that work. And I feel super confident that he knows how to take care of himself because he does. And so it's very, very practical, just physically and what you learn, but on the emotional and mental and just personal growth side, just do it. Nobody in there cares anyhow. So go do your thing and then go home and live your life.
We'll put a bow on this jiu-jitsu thing for anybody that hates it, which by now we're 15 minutes in, so you better just suck it up, Buttercup. Right. But I will say this, as I've grown kind of in Undaunted and some of my understanding of leadership and just matured as a human, I don't like goal setting as much as I like standard keeping, right? So there's goal setting and then there's standard keeping. And I'll set it up this way. You'll have a guy that'll say, hey, they probably won't do an ultra marathon. They'll say, hey, I want to do a sprint triathlon. Okay. It's 3 months from now. It's on the calendar. I've paid my fee. So I'm going to train like crazy for the next 3 months to do this sprint triathlon. So they train. They're dieting. They're getting their rest. They're doing all this stuff. Maybe they're taking peptides. Who knows? And then they go and do the race. And then you know what happens? They take the next 3 months off. Yep. And so if you look at that 6 months period, Jeremy, would it have been better had they just had some sort of a standard for their physical health and cardiovascular health and strength and all that for 6 months, as opposed to train like crazy for 3 months and then to take off 3 months and end up worse than they were at the beginning of the process. And so that's why I tell guys, like, don't set goals, have standards. Like, I don't set a goal to wake up tomorrow to go and work out in my garage gym. That's just what I do. Jiu-jitsu's kind of this weird amalgam of both things, though, because the goal could be to win the next tournament, or the goal could be to train long enough to get my purple belt or to get my black belt or to get my first stripe on my black belt. You can set a goal, but it's the standard that keeps you coming, because as an upper belt, purple, brown, black, there is an ideology that you should be of a certain certain level against people that are vaguely like you. So guys in their late 40s that are at this brown belt level, that are roughly this size, you should be able to have a good match with that type of person, right? That's basically what this means. It doesn't mean you're going to beat, a 22-year-old blue belt that was a wrestler at Oklahoma State.
Yeah.
Like that, that's not who you're being compared to. But you're setting the standard of, this is what I do. It's not that I've gotten my black belt and I stopped training. I know a couple of guys like that. And it's like, gosh, why did you do all this trouble? It's because they set a goal, and the goal was black belt, but they didn't have a standard. So we'll get off of that, because I'm the Apostle Paul for jiu-jitsu. I admit it, but we will get off of that. I want to rewind the clock back 30 years or so. So you're just some knucklehead, and then you decide you want to be a professional knucklehead and become a Marine. So for you individually, why did you want to go in the military? Why'd you pick the Marine Corps?
So, I've tried to answer that question a few times. I was raised in a pastor's home, and so you see up front, right, like very close what that looks like, what it looks like to be a pastor, to be in ministry. My mom and dad, our family, I guess, started a church. And what that meant practically was my dad worked all night, and then he would come home, clean up, take care of my sisters and I. He homeschooled us. And then he would do all the church stuff all day. He'd get a couple hours of sleep at night and then go do the same again, day after day. My mom was working a full-time job to kind of keep a roof over our head and food on the table while that was all happening. So, at like 13, 14, 15 years old, that was the life we were living. And I was super proud of them. I wasn't running from God, but I knew clearly that was not the life that I wanted to live. Well, kind of you connect that to just things I was reading. My dad had given me a book about Congressional Medal of Honor recipients, and I started reading that when I was 12, 13 years old. And so I became interested in that. So this thought of service was certainly a part of my family, but thought of service through the military and what can be done, what is possible. We had some family friends who had been in the military. One of the families who was very close to us, Mr. Stevens, he was, I don't know how old he was when I was a kid, but my dad would take me over there and sit me down next to his chair. He could barely walk, but he was part of the island hopping campaign during World War II. And I heard all those stories. So just the idea of service, the idea of the military, the idea of doing something big and important was drilled into me by my parents. It was demonstrated through these books that I read and these stories that I heard. And then honestly, and I say this sometimes joking, but honestly, I didn't know there was another way to serve in the military other than the Marine Corps until I was like in college, probably. I'm like, I know there are other services. I know that, but like it was never an option, right? It was always the Marine Corps. And I thought, if you are going in the military, you go in the Marine Corps. If you go in the Marine Corps, you go into the infantry. That's just how this thing works, right? And so that's what I did. I set my life toward that, told my parents I wanted to enlist. They said, look, you can do whatever you want. We'll support it, but you need to go to college first. That was very important to them. So I went into college. I found a commissioning program that I could do while I was in college. And I was commissioned as soon as I graduated. So, yeah.
Okay. So Marine Corps.
Yeah.
You decide that you're going to kind of do that from the beginning. Did you think, I'm going to make a career of this?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm just going to do my first contract, or I'm going to do, 20. What were you thinking?
Yeah, I definitely thought that was my career. Again, I think I started talking to my parents about this when I was 14 years old, 15 years old. My whole life had been pointed toward that. I went to college because they made me. It opened a door for me, which was a commission. But I thought I would only ever go into the Marine Corps and serve there as long as they'd let me. Yeah.
So Marine Corps, infantry, you get your commission. And then you do eventually deploy to Iraq and saw combat. And so talk to me. The first thing I want to ask about is a very awkward subject for some people to say. And I love putting people in awkward situations. So ready, set, go.
Yeah, try. But just try.
There is. Okay. Yeah, you're a jiu-jitsu guy. There's no such thing anymore. You've been mounted by a sweaty, angry man. So it's just kind of how it goes.
Yep.
But there simply is a difference in kind between a member of the military that has seen combat and a member of the military that has not seen combat or never went outside the wire. And what I mean by that is where all this kind of is coming from, Jeremy. A buddy of mine was in development group for the Navy SEALs, and they're out every single night on kinetic missions, capture kill missions every single night. And they get back to base on Thanksgiving night, and they're all covered in, other people's brain matter and sweat and different things. And by the time they get back, the only thing left at the Thanksgiving dinner was rolls and butter. And, they all got really, really mad that all these guys that are basically working at the Starbucks on base or there basically just cleaning out the Humvees and all that, got to eat all that stuff. Now, that was how they felt in the moment. Obviously, later they realized, look, we can't go out there and do these capture kill missions unless these guys are taking care of our weapons when we get back, taking care of the Humvees, making sure everything's working properly. And so they had that. But there is kind of this consternation and this, this push and pull between guys that are combat veterans and guys that are just veterans. And so have you ran into that with the work that you've done as you yourself, a combat veteran?
Yeah, for sure. So the work we do with veterans, there is often, and in the programs that we do, there is often this idea that I don't belong here because I didn't serve in combat, or I don't belong here because I didn't deploy, particularly when you're putting, not just people who've been in combat, but people who have been in combat over 20 years. They've done 6, 7 or more deployments. The Marine Corps stayed basically to 6 or 7 month deployments, but the Army was doing like these 18-month deployments, right? And they'd even have, they'd send soldiers home on leave mid combat or combat theater environment, combat theater deployments. And so there is, for some people who've served in the military, this idea that, well, I didn't deploy that way, and so we're not the same, or I need to be ashamed of something. There's a lot to this question, but I'll say a couple things. One, if a person raises the right hand to go into the United States military and they are willing to follow through on that responsibility, now this is an important part of this, right? But they're not going to run from combat if it comes their direction. They raise their right hand, they say, I'm willing. I think I just raised my left hand, but you know what I mean? Raise your right hand, and they say, I'm willing. I'm going to go do this, whatever that means, and they follow through on that. If that takes him into combat or not, there is nothing to be ashamed of. You put yourself in a position where you could, pick up a weapon and defend the ideals that we say we defend in the military. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. So that's number one. But number two, there is something different between someone who's been in combat and someone who hasn't. But that also needs explanation as well, right? When we talk about combat, that means different things to different people. Different units encounter combat differently. I went to Iraq. We were part of the initial invasion into Iraq. We were the first Marine Infantry Battalion into Iraq. And it was very kinetic in the sense that we took a Marine Infantry Battalion. The berm was breached. We pushed through the berm and started killing guys on the other side to secure the first objective. We did a road march to Baghdad. We had engagements along the way. We had a tank platoon with us, right? It was very much a kinetic combat environment. When that ended, we came home. Troops in follow-on would do more of an urban type of combat where they're sitting, in urban environments, and they're dealing with all that's involved in that. And so their combat looked different than mine. There are those who did one combat deployment, which was me. There are those who have done many other combat deployments, right? So again, the combat experience is not the same for everyone, is what I'm trying to say. But if you have been in an environment where you don't have control of what the enemy does, where those tracer rounds are coming back your direction, where the death of someone close to you is imminent, that changes the way you look at the world. And so, those who've been in combat, I think and act and view the world differently than those who haven't.
Hey guys, real quick. If you're anything like me, you are constantly on the lookout for high quality products that are actually made here in America by American hands. The problem is that a lot of American companies have outsourced their labor overseas, so it's an American company, but it's supporting people that don't live here. So I've always wanted to partner with an American company that prioritizes America, American workers, and making all of their materials here in this country. That's why I want to remind you that we are partnered with Origin. Origin is an apparel company based in Maine, and they are focused on getting as much manufacturing back to the United States as they can possibly do. What do they make? They make the best jiu-jitsu gis on the planet, and these are the only jiu-jitsu gis that are made completely in America. They also make jeans. Yes, they're stretchy and awesome. They also make amazing hunting gear, and I know you guys love your Kuiu and your Sitka, but those companies use overseas labor, and they don't do that to help you guys out. They do that to increase their profit margins. Origin also makes boots and work boots, and yes, that does include steel-toe boots. And in the fall of last year, they launched a line of everyday clothing. Their Versa pants are their everyday pants, and they are just especially phenomenal. They also make other outdoor clothes and workout clothes, and they're launching new apparel stuff all the time. If you haven't already, you need to check them out and support a company that supports America and America's workers. Try Origin out today by going to www.originusa.com. That's originusa.com. Use the promo code Undaunted to get 10% off of your order. Again, that's originusa.com. Promo code Undaunted to get 10% off of your order. And it's one of those interesting things where, again, jiu-jitsu example, like there are certain guys. I went to a concert the other day and it was like this underground metal band, my favorite band of all time, named Zayo. And there just this guy, how he was walking up to the line. I was like, that guy wrestled. And then when he got closer, I saw his ears. And so it's like, okay, he didn't get those from doing his taxes. So you kind of feel like you know a little something about a guy like that without them having to say something. And there is a difference when you talk to someone that is a combat veteran, that was in a kinetic situation, that saw death, that dealt death. Like there's something different in how they describe everything, because it's very easy for people like me who has never raised their right hand or left hand to say that I'm going to defend this country from enemies, foreign and domestic. I can be poetic about war. Right? Because I've never smelled rotting flesh and all those things in kind of this war context. But when these guys, there's a certain level of calm, but also a certain level of anxiety in these guys that have done both of these situations. And so I guess to kind of, fast forward to the end of your career, what made you decide, okay, I've done my time in the United States Marine Corps, that's it for me?
So it was a few things all at the same time, and part of it was just ignorance. I went into the Marine Corps in 1996, did reserve time before I was commissioned. It was just the program that I was in, and then started my active duty time in 1999. So my lead up to Iraq was all peacetime Marine Corps. Became a platoon commander, did a peacetime deployment to Okinawa. So all of that happened, right? Well, anyone who's been in a peacetime military, particularly in a leadership position, will tell you it sucks really bad because you're not dealing with combat preparedness or readiness. I mean, you train, you do all of that, but so much of your time is spent dealing with DUIs and behavior issues and marriage stuff that your Marines, in my case, are going through. Like it's all that kind of stuff, right? And so I didn't go into the Marine Corps to do that. I did that and it was fine. We were told shortly after 9/11, we were going to deploy to actually Tajikistan in support of the special operations stuff that was happening in Afghanistan. We got pulled off that at the last minute. We were told then that instead of going to Afghanistan, we're going to go back to Okinawa. And it was during that time that I said, I can't do this anymore. I had a wife, we had 2 little kids, and we were part of a very good church. It was a church plant. I went to church at that point in my life because I knew it was the right thing to do, and I wanted my wife and kids to be in a good church, but started attending there, and God used that in a great way to turn my heart toward ministry, which is something I had said I would never do. So I'm looking at my military career, right? It's about to get to the end of my first contract. I'm going to miss this war. It's going to be over because everything was over quick in the 90s, right? It's not going to go very long. So if I stay in, I've missed it. I'll probably never have another opportunity to do a combat deployment as an infantry guy. That's what I was training for. That's what I wanted to do. And so there was an opportunity to go work at our church when I got out. And so all of that happened at the same time. And then last minute, we're not going to Okinawa now. Now we're going to Kuwait. And then the war in Iraq started. If I had known what that was going to look like, I would have made different decisions. But even when we were in Iraq, we made our way to Baghdad. And after a major engagement in the city of Baghdad on April 10th, the Battle of Baghdad, that was our battalion as well. When that was over, the fighting stopped. We started to do dismounted foot patrols in the city. The whole environment stopped. And so, this is George Bush saying mission accomplished, right? It was that time. And so when we came home, the belief was, all right, the war in Iraq is over. So I also felt confident in like, okay, I went, I did this thing, and it was a one-time thing, and it's over. So it's time for me to move on with my life. So it was a lot of things unfolding all at the same time. I think God obviously directed that, but had I known that there were going to be 20 more years of that, I would have stayed in and done something different. But God used that in my life.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get off the subject of the military, I've asked a lot of guys that are now out of the military. So some of these guys, all mostly combat veterans. Most of the guys I know in that world were combat veterans, saw kinetic fighting, everything from SEALs and Green Berets to Marine Recon, infantry, all that.
Yeah.
all these guys are proud of what they did. They're
Right.
proud of the evil that they took care of. They're proud of the meetings that they scheduled for some of these guys with their maker. They're proud of all those things. What they're not proud of, almost every one of them to a T, is what has become of the United States military. A United States military that seems to be way more concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that, if you've got two mothers and you're growing up in a big city, that you feel comfortable to try to get into the military to see what it can do for you, as opposed to what you can do for your country through the military. And many of these guys are saying, like, look, I'm going to tell my kids to not go into the military.
Right.
Whereas when they were, still in, they're like, man, what an honor it would be if I could have progeny that would want to go into the military. And for these guys that have sons, it's like, man, what if my son could also be a Navy SEAL? What if my son could be a Marine infantry and all these things? And it's because of the wokeness that we've seen in the military. And it's because we seem to be not concerned with the two biggest tasks of the military, which is to kill people and break stuff. We seem to be concerned with all these other things. What about for you? If you were the age you were when you decided to go into the Marines now, would you want to go into it? Like, would you be disappointed if your son wanted to no longer be a police officer and wanted to enlist? Like, where would you be on all these things?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? So my son, who's a police officer, is 23. He's young. When he was coming up, I pushed him toward, why don't you at least go into the Marine Corps as a reservist, and you can get that experience. And so we talked a lot about that. He didn't end up doing that. I have another son who's 14 and actually wants to be a paramedic. So he's decided that the Navy is a place he can get some training and he can become a paramedic, right? And we've had very, not confrontational, but very direct conversations about what that looks like and why. And no, me pushing my older son, there's 7 years between them, me pushing my older son into the military, and now my younger son 7 years later, like, no, I don't think we need to do that, because of exactly that. There are a lot of wonderful people in the Marine Corps, a lot of wonderful people in the military, and I know a lot of them, but the direction, at least right now, that the military is going, it scares me to think of my kids being a part of that. It's a very different world. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but it's a very, very different world than it is today. And it's so crazy, particularly coming up through the infantry. That was my home, right? Like, you're there to do a job. My job is to train these guys, these young men, how to go anywhere in the world at any time and kill bad guys. That's our job. It's not complicated. That's our job. We didn't have these conversations that are being had now. And to think that we are looking at individuals not from the perspective of, are they capable of doing that job, but putting so many other factors on top of it. I mean, we could talk about women in combat. We could talk about all these factors, but the most important thing for a combat unit is to be combat ready. And that means they need to be trained. They need to be healthy. They need to be mentally, spiritually, physically prepared. And we as leaders need to be in a position where we can deploy them. Anything other than that doesn't have a place. And we're at the point now where it's everything other than that we're talking about.
Well, and here's something that seems to make sense to people that are currently in the military, or to just generalized Americans that realize we have to have a standing military of some kind. What makes sense is we need a military to defend the homeland in case of invasion from our north, south, east, or west. We have to have that. Direct conflicts, like, we invade Afghanistan after 9/11 to try and go get the guys. This is all like supposedly, but to go get the guys that perpetrated this crime on the United States and killed thousands of our citizenry, like all that type of thing. But what doesn't make sense to a lot of people is boots on the ground in Ukraine. So going from a proxy war against Russia to an actual war against Russia with, our, 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-old boys going over there to fight for Ukraine. It doesn't make sense to put boots on the ground in Taiwan, just in case China decides they want to invade there. There's a lot of conflicts that are kind of being bandied about that people are like, wait, that's not for us. And even a lot of people I know that, more patriotic Americans seem to have a positive view of Israel and their stance in the Middle East and being the only democracy in the Middle East. But they're the same way about that, is like, man, if Iran and, Syria and Egypt, and if they all just start popping off and trying to take Israel off the map, as they've tried to do several times over the last century or so, people are like, that also is not my son's fight.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want my kid over there in Israel defending all these people either. I think that's an element of this equation too, don't you think?
Oh, 100%. The role of the military is to protect American interests. The role of the American military is to protect American interests at home and abroad. And if there is not an American interest, we shouldn't be involved in that. Now, we can talk about things like democracy and freedom and that, and I think we need to support Israel, for example. I think we need to, at least from a position of public acknowledgement, support countries like Ukraine. I don't think we should be sending them money. We could talk a lot about that. But anyone who's fighting against tyranny, I think we need to support. We're America. But what fixes that problem in many ways, short of putting boots on the ground, is having a strong administration that has a clear understanding of their role in the world. When, again, this isn't a political statement, it's just a true statement. When Ronald Reagan, we'll go back to Ronald Reagan, became president, things changed in the world. Iran did what Jimmy Carter could not get them to do. Around the world, things changed, even into the Soviet Union, because we had a strong president who understood clearly his role in the world, understood that he was a leader, and the rest of the world knew that there would be repercussions, there would be consequences if they behaved badly. When you have an administration in our country that is weak, the rest of the world, tyrants, dictators, these are bullies. These are the kids down the street who pick on little kids, right? They're just in a bigger neighborhood. They, when there's not someone to keep them at bay, will pick on the other kids in their neighborhood, and that's what we're seeing. So a strong administration, in many ways, we saw this in the Trump administration, will keep us from needing to put boots on the ground. There are a lot of other ways we can deal with things around the world. And so, yeah, absolutely. The goal and role of the military is to defend American interests. And you know, I could get off on a tangent here, but not lie about it. I'm thankful for my service. I'm thankful for what I was a part of in Iraq. But looking back 20 years, I don't think we should have been in Iraq. And I feel bad about a lot of that because we were lied to, right? And so it's clarity, it's integrity, it's all of those things from our leadership. But when we have strong leaders, the world is a different place.
Yeah, I mean, peace through strength is an actual thing. Let's talk about Trump. Whenever they were doing negotiations with the Taliban to try to have a organized pullout from the country over a certain period of time, as opposed to an all of a sudden pullout, so that you can have a win, which is what the Biden administration did. Like, it's a famous story now because it's been told by people that were in the room, but Trump looks at the leader of the Taliban at the time, the person that was negotiating, and he says, tell him that if he harms a single one of our military members, that I'm going to kill him, through an interpreter. And he's like, tell him. And then he pulls out a picture of the guy's house and just slides it across to him and then leaves the room. I mean, I get chills just thinking about that story. But even Ben Shapiro's told this story because he was talking about, when Trump was privately talking with Vladimir Putin, and he was basically telling Putin, like, you better behave or else. And Putin's basically like, you're not going to do anything. And Trump says, I might. And just that chance, just that 5-10% chance that Trump's not bluffing is enough to keep someone like Putin, sitting on his hands. And so when you have an administration that's like, they don't even understand what peace through strength is or what it does, it makes a lot of sense that that's not going to be a good thing for us on the international stage, and not good for the people that are having to suffer and die in those conflicts overseas as well. So let's kind of circle back. You're out of the Marine Corps, you're into ministry, but at a certain point, there's kind of this hybrid of military ministry thing that comes up because you are one of the co-founders of the Mighty Oaks Foundation with Chad Robichaux. And so let's talk about that. Like, how do you go from, okay, I'm out of the Marine Corps, oh crap, maybe I shouldn't have gotten out, to doing stuff where you are like helping veterans in these day in, day out ways?
So it's crazy, right? I left the Marine Corps, came home from Iraq. 30 days later, I was out of the Marine Corps and working on a church staff. I could spend a whole episode talking about that. I had such a hard time adjusting to the new role. I didn't realize my identity was so wrapped up with who I was in the military and all those things, right? So I'm working on a church staff. I'm screaming at staff members who I felt like, weren't maintaining the standard, whatever the standard was. I was the standard for everybody. These guys had been to Bible college, and I had literally just come back from combat in Iraq, right? So, like, I'm getting thrown out of staff meetings, and I'm just a complete disaster around the church office, and it was a mess. Then I was a mess at home. Again, I could spend all day talking about that. I was eventually confronted by my pastor and by my dad and by some other people, and was able to get back up and move forward in a positive way. But part of that for me was kind of putting my military service behind me. I did what I went there to do. I did it well. I'm proud of that. But I didn't stay connected to anyone. I didn't talk to anyone that I had served with. I didn't stay connected to anyone. And so I just continued moving on. I served at that church for about 5 years, and then I pastored a church up in the San Francisco area here in California for 7 years. And, needless to say, there aren't a lot of veterans in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we had a great church, but I just felt like that was a phase of my life, and that I don't know what God did there, but I did that, and it's over. 10 years after I came back, had a guy who I had served with reach out to me. He's actually a fighter based in mixed martial artist based in Houston. He now owns a gym and he coaches, but at the time he was fighting and he knew Chad, and reached out to me and said, "Hey, I met this guy, Chad Robichaux. He's starting this program called Mighty Oaks, and having a hard time getting anyone to attend. They're just getting it off the ground. And he knows that I know several guys who served and wants us to come up to Colorado where he's getting this thing started and do a program." So I said, all right. And that's what I did. It's weird looking back on it. I hadn't talked to any of those guys, and I never felt guilty or bad per se, but I just felt like I closed the door and walked away and didn't think I'd ever talk to him again. Went up there. That's where I met Chad. Mighty Oaks was just getting started, and I would go to every program after that and eventually leave the church to be a part of Mighty Oaks. But that day or that week, I think there were 10 guys who were a part of my platoon. Started to hear stories about suicide, started to hear stories about broken homes and broken marriages, all the stuff we hear about veterans. And I had struggled, and part of my struggle was saying, this is probably unique to me, and so I need to put that behind me and walk away. I had been helped, but I hadn't done anything to help anyone else. And I remember where we were when these conversations were had, and I remember the thought that I felt like I had abandoned these guys. Like I said I would be there for you, and in combat I was. I tried to take care of my Marines, but then I left and I abandoned you. And I put that uniform in the closet for the last time, and my service to these guys was over. And I realized, man, like I've been given a gift, and I know the path forward, and I'm not perfect, and I'm still struggling, and there are still issues that I'm dealing with in my marriage and in other places. I don't have it all figured out, but I have the tools. And more than anything, I understand what a relationship with God looks like in this context and how that can carry you forward. And so, really it was that, man. It was like, you still have a responsibility to these guys, not like the military or veterans, but like these guys, right? The guys you served with. And got to know Chad that week, and you're kind of joking about it, but he's super charismatic, and he can get people to do things, but he had just accepted Christ like a year before that. And he was just figuring things out, and certainly didn't know how to run a Christian program or a faith-based program. And so he said, "Hey, would you help me with this thing?" And we started working, and it went from helping these guys to helping, thousands over time. And so, I pastored the church and did that for a while. And then I think 3 years after I was involved with Mighty Oaks, it just got too much, and I had to make a decision. And so we decided, my wife and I decided to resign the church and do the Mighty Oaks thing full time.
So let's talk about programmatically how Mighty Oaks operates, because there are, because of the GWAT, there are so many different nonprofits out there now, and some for-profits that are here to help veterans and their families in a lot of different ways. And, I help with some of them. Like, we love Folds of Honor and the things that they do, and, love Mighty Oaks and different things. There is a different element altogether when there's an explicitly Christian, not explicitly spiritual, because that could be Avatar, putting your ponytail on a tree and trying to like get in touch with the roots kind of thing. But like when there's an explicitly Christian component to the things that you're doing, my buddy out of Florida does Project Save Your Outdoors, Mike Dragich and the stuff that they do. And when it's out front, it's very different, because there's kind of like the completely secular ones. And then there's the ones where it's kind of Christian adjacent, where once you get there, and then once they sit you down and once you talk to the people individually, you realize they're Christians and that's why they're doing it. But then basically when you put your cross in front of everything, it changes the game considerably. So talk to me a little bit about that, because I know between you and Chad, you've had a lot of experience with other nonprofits, with competing nonprofits, frankly. So talk to me a little bit about the difference of this being an explicitly gospel-centered, Christ-centered endeavor.
I think fundamentally the difference is that we believe that short of a relationship with God through Christ, whatever therapies, whatever techniques or habit adjustments you're making are going to fall short. whatever it is you're doing, eventually it has to hit the ground of faith. And again, that can be a broad thing. When I say that, I mean faith, a confidence in Christ and his payment for our sin on the cross, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, because he's God, defeating sin, defeating death, defeating hell, and giving new life, right? And because of that faith, that confidence in Christ, we're able to be reconciled to God. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say faith. If eventually whatever you're doing doesn't hit this ground of faith, confidence in God and a relationship with him, then it's always going to fall short. So there are great therapies, certainly, and I wouldn't even argue that. Medication even has a place, not the place it's been given, but it has a place often, and a lot of other therapies do. But what the clinical world does is they start with the clinical therapies, the medical interventions, these things, and say, if eventually we need to add faith, whatever that looks like, then we'll add it. Our starting point is just different. Our starting point is you need to have a relationship with God in order to find your identity, in order to understand your purpose, in order to be able to move forward with confidence, with hope, and able to throw off the chains of whatever past trauma is holding you back. You have to have a relationship with God or you can't move forward. Now, if we also at some point have to add other kinds of therapies, we can do that as tools. But the hope and the help is found in a relationship with Christ. And so fundamentally, that's what makes us different. We don't add God to the other stuff that's happening. We say that God is the answer, and we just need to get people to that.
Okay, very good. So this is the part where I basically just open it up for you to give a commercial for Mighty Oaks, because there are a lot of folks in our audience that are veterans themselves or are about to be veterans because they're still in the military or they have family that is that. And so who are the guys that y'all help, and how is it specifically that you help them?
So our audience would be veterans. And again, that's a broad category, but veterans, those who have served in the military, active duty service members. We have a lot of active duty folks who come to our programs. First responders. And again, first responders is really broad. Look, I don't want to get into a contest about who's a first responder. It's not, I don't mean with you, but I have people reach out I'm a TSA agent. Am I a first responder? I'm like, yeah, not technically.
No.
But first responders is a broad category for us, and we'll have folks come, and then spouses. So if you're married to one of those, we would invite you to be a part of our programs. We have what we call the Legacy Program. That's a 5-day program at one of 5 locations across the country. We cover the cost of the program for the student. We also cover the cost of travel. So there's no financial output to you to come to one of our programs. Because we're non-clinical, as I just mentioned, there's also no reporting requirement. So particularly for the active duty military folks, those with clearances that they're concerned about, or those in the first responder community, firefighters, police officers, we are a place that you can get help without that help then, or your problems being reported back to your command. So if you're afraid that you're going to have to quit your job after you get this kind of help, you don't have to. So that's important as well. And we start from a position of faith, as you mentioned. Now, it's not all about, it's not camp, like youth camp, right? We talk about trauma. We talk about all of the things that happen in our lives and happen perhaps in combat or in your service in the community. We talk about all of those things. We explain all of those things, but we spend the majority of the week talking about how to find a life aligned to the life that God's called us to. Every one of our instructors, this is important. Every one of our instructors started as a student. They came as a student. Maybe they, accepted Christ, or they rededicated their life to Christ, whatever the case. They go through about a year-long leadership training process that we have, and there's a lot to that. And then they're able to lead. They can teach the classes, they can lead small groups, and they do all of that from a testimonial standpoint. Again, very important. This is not me telling you what I've read that you should do. This is me saying, hey, I know where you are because I've been there. I've struggled the same way you're struggling. I've dealt with a lot of the same things you're dealing with. I don't have it all figured out, but I've started to move forward in my life, and here's how, and I'm going to share that with you. That tears down a lot of these walls that people put up. No one knows what it's like to be me. No one struggled like me, that kind of thing. We get past that really quick. In fact, like our first conversation is, we say it this way, this is not a hug-a-vet program. This is a poke-a-vet in the chest program. Like, we're thankful for your service, but we're not here to say thank you for your service. We've all served. So we got that out of the way, right? If you want someone to make you a quilt or bake you cookies, that's wonderful. That's not what this is about. We're here to poke you in the chest and help you to get up on your feet and start moving forward again. And so that's really what we focus on. We have men's programs separate from our women's programs. We have both, but they're separate programs. And over those 5 days, we just work to help you understand who God created you to be and how to move forward in a meaningful way.
Very good, guys. Well, in the show notes, you can get all the information there. You can go to the website and check out everything that they have going over there at Mighty Oaks. I highly recommend that for anybody that you feel like falls in what you just described there. Yeah. So I could see it on your coffee cup, and I know it's a big moniker for you. March or die.
Yeah.
So when people think of Jeremy, they think of Mighty Oaks and they think of the Marine Corps, but they also think march or die. So you got to tell our audience what is it about that that moniker? Why have you branded your podcast in that way? And what's the deal with that?
Yeah, so that came from a story while we were in Iraq, and I'll give the short version. I wrote about this in the book entitled March or Die. This is part of my podcast, March or Die. I've also told the story there. But it has become a moniker for my life, kind of a mantra for my life. In life, you have the opportunity to make a decision. But as crazy as life may seem, you only get one of two choices. You can stay where you are and die, maybe not physically, hopefully not, but spiritually, emotionally, relationally, or you can do the better thing and march. You can put one foot in front of the other and keep moving forward. Where that came from for me was an actual event. We were, it was April 1st, April Fool's Day, 2003. We were making our way toward an objective that we were supposed to secure. It was a bridge on top of a canal, and we were supposed to get there and just secure the near side. So not go over the bridge, stay on the near side so that other units could follow through. We were given the orders to do this in the middle of the day because there were presumably no enemy soldiers there. Right. And this is military intelligence. It's never been very good. I was the second vehicle back in our column. It's about 1,200 Marines in a battalion. So we're stretched out over a couple of miles. I was navigating for that unit for the battalion. So I had a lead vehicle that was security, and then my vehicle I was navigating, and was on the radio, kind of direct the battalion to that position. As we came around the corner, we came into the straightaway where you could see the berm. On top of the berm was the bridge. That was our objective. And the mortar rounds started to fall around us. Clearly, there were enemy soldiers there. The ground around us was soft enough that those explosions were happening kind of underground. So the shrapnel was contained, but you still have the percussion and the smoke and everything goes along with that. We got closer to the bridge. There was a machine gun position. It was a company-sized element. We found out later, over 100 enemy soldiers in that position that were oriented toward us and started to engage us. And the mortar rounds continued to fall. So we fought our way through that machine gun position. I had to make the decision to push on top of the bridge and just to figure out where the mortars were coming from. We weren't supposed to be there, but we were. Pushed on top of the bridge, got bunched up on top of the bridge. Turns out there was also an anti-aircraft gun there, ZSU-23-4, which is an old Soviet era 23 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. It was there elevated to prevent our aircraft. We got on top. We're the threat. So they start spinning our direction. We got the mortar rounds falling around us. We're caught in that, that kill zone, or what people would call the X of the ambush. And at that moment in time, right? And this is kind of where it all comes together. At that moment in time, a decision has to be made. Are we going to stay where we are and die? We just fought through two other obstacles. We're in a very bad position. We don't know what's coming next. Are we going to stay where we are and die? Or are we going to get out of that kill zone and figure out where we can better engage the enemy from? And we did. That phrase came, actually, the French Foreign Legion used that many, many years ago. That was kind of their moniker, march or die. But the first unit I was a part of in the Marine Corps, when I was a rifle platoon commander, that was their motto, march or die, which I love it because it's Marine proof, right? Like, you don't have a lot of choices. You can march or you can die. And it's crazy what you think of when people are trying to kill you. I've had this experience a few times, but on top of that bridge, it's like, yeah, we've got to get out of here. We need to march. We've got to get out of here. And I have a whole resiliency talk wrapped up in that, and the decision process that's made from time to time. But you find yourself in these battles you didn't expect. We didn't expect that day. You may not get to pick the fight, but you definitely get to decide how you're going to fight. We had to fight. The decision to do that was made, many months and even years before, as we trained for a moment like this one. So you pre-decide how you're going to deal with those engagements that will come. You find yourself on that X, and now you have to make a decision. Am I going to stay here and die, or am I going to move on? And then you have to make that decision. You only have two. As overwhelming as it may seem, you only have two. Put one foot in front of the other, keep moving forward. And when you do, you'll learn finally that, perseverance is a superpower. Just keep pushing forward, and you'll get to where God wants you to be. So, yeah, that's become it didn't happen on purpose. It just kind of became part of my thought process and how I looked at the world. And I started writing about it and talking about it. But march or die, that's it, man. That's all you've got. Stay where you are. You're going to die. But you're making the decision. No one takes that power away from you, or you can march.
Well, and there's also in line with that, and I think I've heard you explain it this ways before. There are people that think that they can just stay where they're at,
you can't.
And that while they make their decision, it's like, no. You are either moving forward or moving backward. You are not hovering in place like that. That's just not how this works. Like this, you have to make some sort of a decision, and the decision to stay does not lead to good things, and the decision to move could lead to much better things. And so I appreciate the way that you've explained that. Now we're kind of getting close to time here, but I did want to talk a little bit about this because you've been in ministry before on the church side. You've been in ministry on the pastoral side, on the nonprofit side. I want to talk generically about men's ministry because when I started Undaunted.Life, it's like, hey, we are a men's ministry. But then even saying it that way, I'm like, I know what people are hearing when I say that. Because typically men's ministry is just women's ministry that's repackaged for men. And so you go to the YouVersion Bible app and you scroll the men's devotionals, and it's as if they were written by women for women. And so they attract a more effeminate type of man. Or you can tell it's like people that are just trying too hard to seem tough and to seem aggro, and they're just not. And that's not authentic and doesn't feel right. And I kept, Jeremy, over the years, I kept having guys ask me like, my church doesn't have a vibrant men's ministry. What can I do? And how can we have a better men's ministry? And blah, blah. And I would keep getting invited to speak at these events that they were calling men's ministry. And it was their once a year thing for men where they make chili or smoke some meat, and they bring in a guy like me to yell at their people and tell them that they suck. And then it's just like, all right, we'll see you guys next year. And so I stopped talking about men's ministry, and I started focusing on what it takes to be a man-friendly church. So it's very different, but it's like most of the time when men walk into a church, especially men that are kind of, rougher around the edges or like things like jiu-jitsu and fighting and combat and things like that, there might as well be a blinking neon sign outside the church saying, this isn't for you. Like, this is for the women and the children. The ministry opportunities, the volunteer opportunities, the mission opportunities are going to ping way more effeminate. And if that's not you, it is what it is. The music is going to be more so homoerotic, more so like emotionalism, as opposed to like singing to the God of the universe as if he's the God of the universe. And the sermon content is going to be a little bit more TED Talky with a little bit of practical Bible verses that you can sprinkle over the top. So it's more life lessons and not, exegesis of the scripture and all that. And most men are like, these people don't even need me. I'll go somewhere where I'm needed. And so I'm trying to encourage, men like, hey, worship leaders, think about the men in the audience, think about the men in the congregation rather, and think about why they're not singing. Is it the way you're presenting yourself? Is it the lyrical content of what's being sung? Is it the key that you're singing in that the man can't hit? For the pastor, is this content going to invigorate the heart of a man? Because it's like, it's not the mom that keeps the family in church and helps raise the children to be believers as well. It's a dedicated father that is dedicated to discipleship and catechizing their entire family and performing headship of their household. So what is your experience and your opinion on that? Because you've seen this thing that I'm talking about basically from all sides of the issue.
I have, and you and I have talked about this too. And you've even a lot of what you talk about has helped me think through some of this. But it's interesting because I think we're told like something like 70% of churchgoers are women, something like that. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it's a lot, right? And if you look around your normal church on a Sunday morning, you'll go, oh, I didn't notice this, but that's true. Even if you're in a church that doesn't, necessarily per their faith statement believe that women should be pastors, most of the leadership in the church would be women as well, right? And so it's like, well, you can't stand and preach, but you can do everything else. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying if you look at who's leading the church, who's attending the church, who's guiding what happens at the church in a lot of churches, and again, a lot of research would say in most churches, it's women. So then there's almost like this overcorrection, right? So then there are people who are like, I want to make a church for men. And if women want to come along, they can. Well, then you get into like this silly, like if you don't, if you're not an MMA fighter, if you're not a hunter, if you're not this or that, if you don't like, swords and carry 3 guns, then you don't fit here because that's what a man is, right? Like, well, that's not what a man is either. And so my opinion and where I feel the most comfortable, it's funny, I was preaching at a church a couple months ago, and it wasn't even on men's topics or anything else. I was preaching, and someone came up to me afterwards like, man, the way you preach is just so, and he paused, like, it's just so masculine. What are you talking about? Well, it's preaching the truth of the word of God. Robert Lewis is an author. He writes a lot to men, and he said, real men reject passivity, accept responsibility, and lead courageously. And to me, that's what a man is. It's not a style per se. It's not a thing that you do. Some people love jiu-jitsu and others don't. It's doing hard things. It's being responsible for the family that God has given to you. It's leading that family. It's leading in a society and a culture that is pushing you down and saying that you have no place and you have no voice. It's understanding what God's word says, which means you study it and you know what it says. And then it's responding to what it says. It's doing what God has called you to do. It's doing those hard things. And man, why it's so hard for churches to call men to do that. Why we take a middle ground and it's like, well, men and women are basically the same. And we're basically, I just don't understand that messaging because it's not biblical messaging. And so I think where a pastor needs to be and where a church needs to be is asking the question, what is the role of men? What is the role of women biblically? And how do we help the men and women in our church express that? If we would do that, then we would see men being men and stepping up. And it's crazy to me that that's not just the normal. Even if you look at the New Testament examples, right? You look at the church of the New Testament, it's strong men being strong men. I don't know if they ate raw meat or not, but I know they stared down some very powerful people and did so with a strong backbone, that there were a lot of people watching who, after the death of those martyrs who stood those people down, went out and changed the world. And we need to be those kind of men. And we've become so complacent and so comfortable. And a pastor needs to call men to action and getting away from that.
Well, part of the problem, Jeremy, is we're taking our cues from culture. And so much of the modern church has accepted its positioning as downstream from culture. And so if you're downstream from culture, you will be more egalitarian than complementarian because that's what the culture is. Right. It's, well, anything a man can do, a woman can do. And the reality is if that is not a biblical ethic, that is a cultural ethic. Right. And so the biblical ethic is men and women are created equal in the sight of God and in his image, but they don't have the same role and purpose. And so, but that is anathema to culture. Like you couldn't possibly say that. You're telling me a woman can't be the CEO. You're telling me the woman can't do this. You're telling me you start getting into those conversations. And so that's where I think a lot of modern pastors have really screwed the pooch, is because what they do is that they figure out what 5-week series they want to do. They want to figure out what life lessons they want you to walk away with. And then they start thinking about the scripture they want to apply to how to be a better person. But it's like, guys, this isn't how to win friends and influence people. Right. Like this is the gospel being taken to every people group and to the ends of the earth so that, Christ could gather his flock, as it were. Yeah. And so that's the thing that I think for a lot of guys is the same to your point that you made about the aggro guys, where if you don't eat beef jerky, have a 4-wheel drive truck covered in mud and kill animals on the regular, that you're not a man either. That's also being downstream from culture, because that is like caricature, machismo and all that. And some of those things in and of themselves are not wrong. But as my pastor buddy, Joby Martin, would say, those things make you awesome. They don't make you a man though. And so I think that's very applicable here. And so, man, we've weaved in and out of a lot of different conversations here and talked about a lot of different things, but I can't think of anything else to ask you. Actually, I have a lot more things I could ask you, but we don't have all the time in the day. But that is all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, man, I appreciate it. Thanks for the work that you do and for being a clear voice for a lot of men who need it.
All right, Jeremy, appreciate you. We'll see you next time. There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed my time with Jeremy. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. 2 links I've got for you today: a link to Jeremy's website so you can check out his podcast, his books, all of his speaking opportunities there, and also a link to the Mighty Oaks website. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.